What if one of the most influential movements of the 20th century wasn't communism, but anarchism? In the chaos of the Russian Civil War, it almost happened. We remember Lenin and Trotsky, but history has largely forgotten men like Nestor Makhno, who led a peasant army under the black flag of anarchy and carved out a stateless territory in Ukraine from 1918 to 1921. His free territory offered a radical alternative to Bolshevik rule. In less than 3 years, they built a society without rulers from the ashes of empire. But when they challenged the Bolsheviks, everything changed. Stay with me to see how this story could have reshaped the entire century. This experiment was more threatening to the Bolsheviks than any White Army general. Monarchists wanted to turn the clock back. Lenin and Trotsky knew how to fight that. But Makhno's anarchists offered a rival vision for the future, a working, popular alternative to the centralized state. If it succeeded, it would reveal the Bolshevik model as just another form of domination. That couldn't be allowed. So the Bolsheviks struck a bargain. They needed Makhno to help defeat the Whites. For a time, the Black Army and the Red Army fought side by side, halting Denikin's march on Moscow, an alliance that may have saved the revolution for Lenin. But as soon as the Whites were broken, the Bolsheviks moved to crush their former allies. Trotsky ordered the Red Army to hunt down the Makhnovists. Communes were destroyed, leaders were executed or driven into exile. The Free Territory was wiped from the map. But the idea didn't die. The Makhnovists' defeat was not an ending, but a warning shot, a proof that another path had almost been possible. In the north, new unrest was brewing, and the Bolsheviks were about to face a challenge from within their own ranks, one that would force a final reckoning with the revolution's original promise. March 1st, 1921. Kronstadt, an island fortress at the edge of the Gulf of Finland, guarding the frozen approach to Petrograd. The sailors of the Baltic Fleet, once immortalised as the revolution's pride and glory, stand in open defiance. These are not white generals or foreign invaders, but the same men who stormed the Winter Palace in 1917. 4 years under Bolshevik rule have changed everything. The promise of workers' power has faded. The Soviets have become hollow, their debates stifled, their leaders replaced by party loyalists. The countryside starves as grain is requisitioned at gunpoint. The secret police, the Cheka, rule through fear. The sailors, once the vanguard, now see only betrayal. They do not fire the first shot. Instead, they draft the Petropavlovsk Resolution, a manifesto that echoes the revolution's original spirit with devastating clarity. They demand new elections to the Soviets, but this time, Soviets without communists. They call for freedom of speech and press for all left-wing socialists and anarchists, the release of political prisoners, and an end to the Cheka's reign of terror. This isn't a counter-revolution. They call it a third revolution, a return to the ideals of 1917. For Lenin, this is more dangerous than any external threat. If Kronstadt's message spreads, the Bolshevik claim to represent the working class could crumble overnight. Lenin's response is immediate and brutal: crush the rebellion, no negotiations. But Kronstadt is an island, and the Gulf of Finland is frozen. A bridge of ice, 8 miles wide, the only path for an assault. Historian accounts note, a freak cold snap kept the Gulf frozen into late March, allowing Trotsky's shock troops, camouflaged in white, to storm the fortress in a bloody assault. But imagine the thaw hits a week early. The ice cracks and buckles, splitting the Red Army's path. The cannons of Kronstadt command the sea lanes. Bolshevik forces can only watch from the mainland, powerless to attack. In that moment, everything shifts. The sailors' message, smuggled across the treacherous floes by night, reaches Petrograd's hungry workers. The city, already simmering with unrest, erupts. Sympathy strikes become a full general strike. Factories grind to a halt. Workers pour into the streets, emboldened by news that Kronstadt still stands. The government's grip on Petrograd slips. The rebellion's call, Soviets without communists, echoes through garrisons and barracks. Soldiers, weary of endless war and repression, begin to question their orders. Far to the south, the news stirs the embers of another revolt. Makhno's surviving partisans, scattered and hunted in the Ukrainian steppe, hear that the Bolshevik heartland is in turmoil. For months, they have waited. Now, with Moscow distracted and Petrograd in chaos, they regroup. The Black Army launches a new offensive, re-establishing a southern front. Suddenly, the Bolsheviks face enemies on 2 fronts, a political uprising in the north and a military resurgence in the south. Pressure mounts from every direction. The Cheka cannot suppress strikes everywhere at once, The Red Army, stretched thin and demoralised, hesitates to fire on fellow revolutionaries. The authority of the Bolshevik state, already brittle, begins to fracture. Could such a stateless federation actually work at empire scale? Let's find out. Kronstadt, once a tragic last stand, becomes the spark for something unprecedented. The Third Revolution spreads. The old order collapses, not just the Bolsheviks, but the very idea of a centralised Russian state. In Petrograd, workers' councils seize control of factories and neighbourhoods. In Ukraine, communes and militias reappear, answering to no central authority. Across the former empire, cities and villages form their own assemblies, electing delegates and recalling them at will. The machinery of state, party bureaucrats, secret police, commissars, vanishes almost overnight. The black flag replaces the red over the Winter Palace. But this is not a single, unified regime. It is a patchwork of Soviets, communes and councils, each fiercely independent, bound only by a shared refusal to accept any new rulers. The Russian Free Federation is born, not as a state, but as a sprawling, decentralised network. There is no Kremlin, no General Secretary, no 5-year plan. Only the question: can such a federation survive the storms to come? Because the world beyond Russia is changing fast, and soon this new order will face its greatest test. Spanning millions of square miles and 7 million inhabitants, the Russian Free Federation emerges as a living contradiction. Vast, ungoverned, and fiercely independent. There is no Kremlin, no General Secretary, no 5-year plans or iron-fisted decrees. Instead, what takes shape is a sprawling confederation of self-governing territories, each holding a different answer to the question of how people should live together. In the cities, urban Soviets and worker-run factory councils manage production, not for profit, not for state quotas, but for the needs of their communities. In the countryside, rural communes hold land in common, making decisions through direct assemblies. Coordination happens through voluntary agreements, managed by federated councils that rise and fall with the will of those they represent. The soul of this federation is a stubborn refusal to let any authority, no matter how righteous, settle over the land like a shadow. It isn't a state, it's an agreement to live without one. Fragile, chaotic, and idealistic, this is an experiment in freedom the 20th century never saw. But the world outside doesn't pause for experiments. In Berlin, Germany's leader gaze falls east. He doesn't see a rival superpower. He sees a territory he believes is broken, a chaotic expanse ripe for conquest. To him, the Russian Free Federation is proof of the failure of non-state governance, a void begging to be filled. In his eyes, this isn't a nation to be defeated, but a landscape of Lebensraum, living space, waiting to be seized and remade in Aryan image. His generals plan for a lightning campaign, convinced that a headless, stateless Russia will collapse at the first blow. One of the defining moments of the pre-war world, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, never happens. There is no Soviet Union to sign secret protocols, no cynical handshake dividing up Poland. Anarchist ideology sees fascism as its absolute antithesis. The anarchists of the CNTFAI in Spain proved it. Fascism's worship of state power, its violent repression, its demand for obedience, all stand in direct opposition to everything the Federation represents. It leaves no room for a cynical deal, only a brutal clash, as seen in Spain with the CNTFAI. When the German leader looks east, he finds no partner, only enemies. Fast forward to 1941. Germany's generals believe they'll face nothing but a broken backwater. How wrong they are. The Wehrmacht crosses the border, expecting to shatter a central nervous system, to capture Moscow, encircle armies, and force surrender from a government already on its knees. What happens when Blitzkrieg meets 1 million armed townspeople instead of an army? There is no Red Army waiting in formation, no rigid hierarchy to decapitate. Instead, the Germans find millions of armed citizens, organised into local militias. These are not soldiers fighting for a distant flag. They are workers defending their factories, villagers defending their communes, neighbours defending each other. Each region, each city block, each forest becomes its own front, its own war. The German doctrine of Blitzkrieg, designed to break the spine of a state, collides with a resistance that has no spine to break. Capturing a city like Minsk or Kiev doesn't force surrender. The fight simply moves to the next village, the next rail yard, the next stretch of woods. Occupation becomes a nightmare of endless ambushes and sabotage, a true people's war with no end in sight. The Western Allies watch, baffled. Churchill and Roosevelt want a partner on the Eastern Front, but there is no single leader to call, no headquarters to coordinate with, no treaties to sign. The Federation refuses to behave like a state, but it doesn't waver in its fight. Allied planners struggle to understand how to support a decentralized resistance that absorbs the brunt of the Wehrmacht's power, even as it refuses to fit into any diplomatic box. There are no grand conferences, no formal alliances, only a relentless, unyielding front against fascism. The war in the East becomes longer, messier, more localised. Every town, every field, every rail line is contested. The German advance slows to a crawl, then grinds to a halt. The cost is staggering, but the Federation endures. When Germany finally collapses, there is no Soviet superpower rising from the ruins, no Iron Curtain drawn across Europe, no Eastern Bloc, no Cold War in the shape we know. Instead, the map is left open, the future unwritten. The victory of this third force doesn't promise a utopia. It sets the stage for a world with different conflicts, ones fought not just over economics or ideology, but over the very idea of power and who should wield it. Makhno's idea that power must always remain local still haunts us today. A victory for this third force would not have brought a utopia. It would have meant something messier, a world where the old struggle between the state and the individual never faded into the background. This fork in history was buried because it threatened every regime, left or right. The demand for free Soviets and a stateless society posed an uncomfortable question. Why do the most radical visions get crushed first, no matter who holds the reins? The world we know grew up in the Soviet shadow. Looking back at the path not taken forces us to ask, if radical freedom could be crushed once, what radical ideas are we ignoring today? If you want more forgotten forks in history, subscribe and explore our archives.